In this video, I'll demonstrate placing a lifeline in lace knitting. Lace knitting can be complicated knitting, therefore it can be very helpful to place a lifeline frequently. Lifelines are helpful because they are a safety net in case a mistake is made in the lace. You can safely rip back to a spot in the knitting where everything is correct, and you can be sure to not drop any stitches. It's easiest to place a lifeline in lace where you are working the lace on right side rows only, and the wrong side rows are what's called resting rows, where you are purling back. This makes it easy to pick those stitches back up if you need to rip down to a lifeline spot. Not all lace is like this, however. Some lace is worked on every row, right sides and wrong side rows. So it can be a little more complicated placing a lifeline in this kind of lace. It's still doable. I highly recommend placing your lifelines on the final row of a particular vertical repeat. This way you know which row you will be at when you rip back to that particular lifeline. Make sure though that your stitch count is correct and the pattern is correct before you place your lifeline. The best yarns or threads to use to place as lifelines are something smaller than your working yarn and something very smooth so that it will not snag on your working yarn. Something like unwaxed dental floss or sewing thread or a single strand of embroidery floss or very thin crochet thread. Those are all great options to use to place as a lifeline. You could also use a very thin ribbon as a lifeline. There are a couple of ways you can place a lifeline. If you are using interchangeable needles with an adjustment hole in the cables or the needle tips, you can place a lifeline as you knit across. If not, or you don't want to place a lifeline that way, you can place a lifeline after you've worked the row where you want to place your lifeline. I've finished a right side row in this lace pattern, and if I want to place a lifeline in the next wrong side row, I'm going to use fine sewing thread as my lifeline. Going to cut a long length, plenty long enough to span the width of my piece, and I happen to be using interchangeable needles. So I'm going to get set up to work my wrong side row. And on the needle tip that will be my working needle, I'm going to thread my sewing thread through the adjustment hole. It might be easier said than done. Might need to use a needle threader for that part. And I'm going to loosely tie a knot a little ways away from the cable so that I can remove this thread. So the thread is secured to the needle tips, but the thread can easily be removed after I've placed the lifeline. This using thin sewing thread helps with this because the knot will not interfere as the lifeline gets placed. So I'm set up to run my lifeline along as I knit, and I'm going to knit my wrong side row. One drawback to placing it as you go is if you happen to make a mistake in this wrong side row, then your lifeline will be placed in a row with a mistake. The other drawback to this method is if you slide stitch markers, if you're using stitch markers and you slide them onto your needle, the stitch markers will be trapped in that lifeline. So if you are using stitch markers and you do not want them trapped in your lifeline, you can slip them off the needles um, as you're working this row and then place them back in the knitting on the next row after you are done placing the lifeline. So as I am working the lace, the lifeline is being strung along with the cable of the needle tips. I'll finish working this row and show you what it looks like. Now as I pull these stitches, onto the cable, the lifeline, might be hard to see here since it's also red, the lifeline has been pulled along with the cable. So I locate the other side of the lifeline, this side of the lifeline, pull, then I can cut the lifeline out of the adjustment hole. And I like to have my lifelines be nice and long so that I can loosely tie a knot in the two ends, securing that lifeline so that it doesn't accidentally get pulled out of the knitting at any point in time, which can be easily done with thin thread like this sewing thread. So after I tie that knot, I can cut the excess lifeline so that it's not in my way. And there's a lifeline placed in my knitting. Now as I knit back, the lifeline will be in that row only, as an option to drop back to if I need to. Now, if you don't want to place your lifeline as you knit across, you can place it after you've done a wrong side row or your last row in a vertical repeat. Let me work a right side and a wrong side row and I'll show you how to do that. One note, as you are working the next row after placing the lifeline, especially when using thin thread like this sewing thread, make sure it's out of the way as you are working your stitches. So keep it oriented down and don't knit into it. Knit into the stitches above so that you don't mess up where that lifeline is placed. I've just finished working a wrong side row. So if I want to place a lifeline now, I slide my stitches onto the cable portion of the needle to give myself room. I get a very small tapestry needle and my lifeline material. Again, get a very long piece, long enough, plenty long enough for the width of your piece. Because I'm using slippery sewing thread, I'm going to thread through my tapestry needle and then a little ways from the needle eye, and then a little ways from the needle eye, I'm going to make a knot just to secure that thread so it doesn't come out of the tapestry needle while I'm placing my lifeline, like so. Now you want to thread your tapestry needle through every stitch, every loop that is on the cable needle. And our right legs are in front. We're knitting in Western style with the right legs mounted in front. So we will just follow the cable and insert the tapestry needle through every stitch. Try not to split your yarns as you do this. Using a blunt tapestry needle can help, but again, it needs to be thin enough to get through what could be tiny little stitches. And thread through every single stitch. Don't miss a stitch. Can help to have a lighted magnifying glass if you're working with very small stitches. If you have a stitch marker or multiple stitch markers, you can either thread through the stitch marker, which will trap the stitch marker in the lifeline, or if you do not want to trap your stitch markers, you can go around the stitch marker. So I'm coming up on a stitch marker. I can go through the stitches in front of the stitch marker and then go around the stitch marker and catch the stitches on the other side. This way the stitch marker will not be trapped. If you do want to trap your stitch markers, you can do so. On the next row, you will need to drop those stitch markers so that they can stay with the lifeline, and place new stitch markers if you are needing stitch markers. Like so. And I can cut the thread off of the tapestry needle. Find the beginning end of the lifeline. And make a knot a ways down the ends, leaving plenty of slack for the lace, but securing the lifeline from being accidentally removed. So there is the lifeline I placed as I knitted across, and here is the lifeline I've just placed in this wrong side row. So that was a couple of ways to place a lifeline in lace. I know it maybe was hard to see with the fine stitches and the thin thread used for the lifelines, but hopefully it was a helpful demonstration for you. Have you used lifelines in your lace knitting? Let me know in the comments below. I hope this was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.